Good morning, everyone. Céad Níl Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes to what is, rather sadly, our last social marketing session, celebrating 50 years of social marketing past and hopefully another 50 years of great social marketing to come. As part of that celebration, we have the unique pleasure of hearing from two very well-known, seasoned social marketing experts. So we have Professor Alan Tapp and Professor Jared Hastings coming to us, both who have worked extensively in social marketing. And for those of you who are in the field, no doubt you know of their work and what they write to in particular. You'll know Alan can be very controversial and can be quite political and opinionated, and I've no doubt that's what we're going to get a taste of today. And Jared, of course, is a great storyteller, so much so that he has a new book out called Hyperconsumption: Corporate Marketing versus the Planet. And based on that, we can look forward to a wonderful session. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite Alan to share his screen and kickstart our last session celebrating social marketing. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let's see how I get on with the go to there. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
So this is I don't know whether this is going to be semi-chaotic or not. It's certainly opinionated in the sense that it is, some of it's evidence-based, some of it is based on the ongoing commentary on COVID-19 in the UK from Private Eye magazine, which is a satirical magazine in the UK. And there's a doctor on there called Phil Hammond, who's absolutely brilliant. And he's obviously a journalist as well, but he's primarily a frontline doctor, and he has commented throughout the pandemic on what's been going on in the UK. So I've lent heavily on that, and also on things like Radio 4's a BBC radio program called More or Less, which is also has got guests on like David Spiegelhalter and stuff. So, and David is a professor in Cambridge of public understanding of risk. So there's plenty of sort of scholarliness in there, but there's also plenty of me fulminating this. So feel free to disagree. I'm such a coward that if you do disagree, I'm highly likely to instantly agree with your new view and jump to that. So my bark is far worse than my bite on these things always. Oh yes, great point. So so anyway, there we go. Okay. For some reason it's not.
Try using the arrows at the bottom of the screen, Alan.
I have. I might flip back out of and then let's try pressing the good old return button.
Try the arrows on the laptop or your computer, Alan.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Might just have frozen.
Oh, here we go. Using the mouse. This is a summary slide of the summary. I'll run through these quite quickly. I don't like PowerPoint very much, but I ended up sort of giving in a bit on it into myself. And so I think the summary kind of things I'm trying to say are that pandemic outcomes in terms of deaths per million of the population, the UK has not done very well. Now, why is that? I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but the kind of conclusions that I'm drawing out of this is that if you want to do well in a pandemic, do well before it. And by doing well, I'm suggesting baseline public health. It's so obvious, it probably doesn't need saying. Baseline public health, the base level of public health that you've got in your population before the pandemic starts, if you've got that at a good level, it will save lives. And that's a structural issue, not necessarily an individual choice very much. Properly funded health services will save lives. And the UK public health services have not been brilliantly funded. There are many countries worse off than us in the world, but the UK has not covered itself in glory on that. And you can't catch that up during a pandemic. And that's been really clear. During the pandemic, a collective approach probably beats an individual approach. This is up for grabs. This is an opinion, but there's a lot of good commentary out there about this. Collectivism beats individualism. Come on to that a little bit. Another point about the UK is that there's a lot of stuff come out in the last 2 or 3 weeks about corruption in this country. Our corruption index, as part of the international picture, I presume is not done terribly well out of the last 2 or 3 weeks. Well, the news is that we've been doing this stuff corruptly for a long time. And what I mean by that is we've been handing what should be public service work on public health in particular to private profiteering. And that was a disaster for us, and it cost lives. Behaviour change, getting closer to the bone for us in social marketing. Structure beats agency, seems to me. We can, and if we ask people to do things as individuals, by the nature of pandemics, a virus is something that transmits between groups of people. So the word group is a key there. So structural approaches beat agency approaches. And then after this pandemic, as we all move to sort of post-pandemic management now, I'm suggesting we've got global changes needed to our eating habits, our health-wealth balance, and our attitude to Mother Earth, which I won't cover in detail, but just to mention. And then perhaps a conversation to have: what's the acceptable death rate in life across everything? And that's an interesting, I just think that's a really interesting, sobering conversation that I don't often hear us having out loud in public, because it's sensitive and people say zero, we want 0 deaths. Well, how is it that we tolerate 2,000 deaths a year on Britain's roads then? More than, what is it? Something like 1 million deaths a year across the world for car crashes are tolerated as a structural issue. Now, that's clearly an acceptable death rate, but it's not one that's ever talked about for the price of driving around in our vehicles. So why aren't we having that conversation, and why don't we have it with other things as well? Okay, so a bit more detail about UK versus the world. How did we do? Well, we started, do you know what, in 2016, we created in this country a very, very in-depth risk assessment of viruses like MERS and SARS-1, and we assessed those risks extremely accurately in an in-depth way, and then we completely ignored the findings. And so what we did do when the pandemic first hit was we were optimistic, and we did nothing, actually. We just thought, oh, it'll go away. And then Boris Johnson our Prime Minister Boris Johnson came on the TV a lot and said, wash your hands, and that'll solve it. No, shit, no, it didn't. So, right, lockdown. Then let's go into test, track and trace, but let's privatize that. Let's give it to Deloitte and Sitel, a company I used to work with when I was in the private sector, who used to do telemarketing, by the way, and somehow Sitel then became the instant experts on a highly complex operation of pandemic testing, tracking and tracing. So that was a disaster, a £40 billion disaster that cost lives. So that's oh shit times 2. The vaccine has been a heroic story of global kind of triumph of science over nature for the time being, but of course with you know, that's an ongoing battle. We've had 4 lockdowns in the UK, and we're now into living with COVID. And as I say, what's the acceptable death rate? So there's a picture of ideology versus management by evidence that I think has blighted the UK's approach to handling COVID. And there's a phrase, micro-consumerist bollocks, that came from George Monbiot, where he's talking about, oh, let's distract from corporate in his case, he was talking about corporate bad doings. And so let's distract from that by sort of diverting it onto the individual. You could argue it's victim blaming, but it's sort of diversionary tactic, saying, oh, if you want to save the planet, then you yourself have to act. It's nothing to do with us in industry. It's nothing to do with us in government. It's all about you, and then they call that freedom. So there you go. There's the propaganda. Just throw in the word freedom, and away you go. Oh, I've got freedom, right? Okay, that's all right then. So that's what's happened, unfortunately, in the UK. The prevailing ideology of the current administration is centre-right kind of political ideology, which basically says, under the cloak of freedom, basically says, over to you. If you want to be fit and healthy, that's fine. That's your choice, all to do with choice and the usual stuff. So it's total crap, of course. And what it does is it gives industry, private sector, a free hand to behave badly in a way everybody knows. When does policy incompetence become corruption? Well, when the governments have got their own hands in the till, and the government's cronies get paid for doing a really terrible job. So Dido Harding, Deloitte, the Behavioural Insights team did not cover themselves in glory. The David Holtburn bunch in government have absolutely not covered themselves in glory with this. They suggested we nudge our way out of this pandemic. How's that gone? You can't make up what some of the stuff that was going on. And one of the things, by the way, about that was the issue of behavioural fatigue came out as an excuse to do nudge. So the public will get tired if we lock down the public. They'll get tired of being locked down. Well, true, and therefore they'll start breaking the lockdown laws. Not true. So they had no evidence for that whatsoever. But that was just another reason to delay lockdown or to introduce this sort of ideology of social marketing by passing it on to individuals. Testing was a complete national scandal, as I've said, but don't worry, the inquiry won't report until 2027. That'll be all right. COVID interventions, so towards solutions now. Let me try and move let's get that down there so I can see. So yeah, as usual, structure beats agency, I'm afraid. There's always room for agency. There's always room for passing on something to Alan Tapp and saying, you take responsibility for your life, Alan. And I'm very happy with that. There's a bit of a stroppy libertarian in me, you know, and I'm happy now that I've reached the grand old age, I'm happy to kind of acknowledge that. And I don't like being told what to do and so on. But structural changes are just they're much more powerful if you can introduce these population level changes or ecological changes into society. You've got much more chance. So poor public health turbocharged. The UK's numbers on death rate per million population from COVID are pretty high. They're not the highest in the world, but they're high. And one key reason for that, these things are always multifactorial, and I'm happy to acknowledge that. So please don't misquote me that I'm suggesting this is the only reason, but our obesity levels are very high in this country. And that type 2 diabetes link with COVID deaths is apparently there. I need to double check the science on that, but it's been widely reported. Doesn't mean it's that I'm being accurate here, but that's my understanding. So if so, put in place a society that understands why being physically fit is so important and how to do so. Now, we absolutely do not do that here in the UK. We talk about it a lot, but we don't do anything to promote physical activity, eating well. So being physically fit, exercising is one side of that, and sugar, of course, is the other. Stating a few really obvious things, it would be great if we funded care homes and social care properly, wouldn't it? And I think left-wing governments in the past have been just as bad as the current administration in tackling that. Funding primary care and secondary care properly. We've got a disastrous level of funding compared to even the European average, and we're one of the more wealthy European countries, and our numbers are really poor on that. If another variant strikes, locking down early is probably beats locking down late. UK had a poor record on that. Vaccine take-up, our vaccine hesitancy was not too bad, but I'm interested in Gerard's view, actually, as living in France, as I believe he does now, that the famous French vaccine hesitancy may have dissipated somewhat, so that'll be one to discuss later on. Because the French vaccine take-up now is actually nudged ahead of the UK's. The vaccine, obviously, the vaccine's a relative success story in all of this. We have the world's best trained public health consultants, I'm reliably informed, from public health experts in this country, and I'm currently funded by some of them. Why not use them? That would be a refreshing change. And yeah, things like prioritizing well-ventilated building designs and so on is also part of it. So motoring on, I don't want to chew into the clock at all here. In fact, let me see if I can find out what my time is. Yeah, so I've given myself roughly another 5 minutes or so at the most.
Yeah, you've got loads of time, Alan. Plough ahead.
Okay, Christine, thank you. I don't want to eat into anybody's time here. So yeah, collective action, collectivity. Stephen Riker, R-E-I-C-H-E-R, Steve Riker up in St Andrews talks a lot about this, and he's well worth tuning into, a leading expert in this kind of area of social psychology. But clearly, with the two key ways in which you can manage a pandemic, you can either vaccinate against it and/or you can quarantine. So, and then personal quarantine, hands, face, space, fresh air. In the UK, we went with hands, face, space, and then we added fresh air to it, quite rightly, because ventilation is incredibly important to managing an airborne virus. And fine, but don't ask individuals to do this as a personal choice, which is what we're being asked to do at the moment. This should not be a personal choice. If I as a personal choice decide not to bother with hands, face, space, fresh air, I'm affecting you. So why is that a personal choice? It's ludicrous. It's laughably kind of illogical, and yet that is what our current government policy is in this country. So vaccine management, hesitants are completely different to anti-vaxxers. And vaccine hesitants, there's a well-versed ways of dealing with both hesitants and anti-vaxxers. With hesitants, a 20-minute chat with an expert usually converts hesitants into vaccine take-up. And then anti-vaxxers, you can't talk them round. And there's some pretty strange belief systems going on there. So it's not gonna happen. And some of that could be malicious intent. There's quite clearly malicious intent with anti-vaxxers here and there. In other words, they don't actually believe what they're saying. They're just doing it to cause trouble. And you can respond to that, according to Stefan Lewandowski, a leading expert in propaganda and dealing with this sort of propaganda, by fact, myth, explain, fact, which basically is repeat the facts, repeat the myth only if you have to. Ideally, don't need to mention the myth at all, but if you do, then just repeat it once, then explain why it's a myth, then repeat the fact to finish. So fact, myth, explain, fact is in the Lewandowski handbook of dealing with all of that, which I was briefly involved in helping with. So the hands, face, space, fresh air. It's interesting, in the UK, we're obsessed with masks. They've become ideological battlegrounds. They do work. I'm not suggesting anything else. I've done lit reviews on the science of masks, and they work. They're a pretty minor effect, mind. They're a lot less effective than fresh air. Fresh air beats the shit out of everything else. Be out if you want to avoid catching COVID. Be outside, or open the window. And I know it's cold. I realise that, but masks have become a real ideological battleground because they're visible. This whole visibility thing about labeling people. It's like a form of racism or whatever. There's a stigma attached to not wearing a mask or to wearing one or whatever it is, and it becomes, and all that crowds out common sense. That's my point. Masks become ideological, and then they crowd out common sense or crowd out logic. Whatever. Fresh air beats face. Hands is less important as well. This is an airborne virus. It's transmitted in droplets less than 5 micrometers in width. The virus itself is 1/10,000th the size of a full stop. So it's just bad news wrapped up in a protein. My PhD is in chemistry, so I've done a bit of sort of science, proper science sort of stuff, delving around into the background of this to try and understand it a little more. So yes, you should wash your hands, but it's much less important than space, the 2 meter space or whatever, and fresh air. Those are the 2 key ones, primarily airborne virus. And then other stuff, sort out our national testing strategy. Are we in or out? What I mean by that is I was involved quite a bit with my funders trying to work out what on earth to do about the public response to testing. And it was not easy, and that's because the national strategy didn't exist. We were being asked to test, but nobody was telling us why. It's terrible. COVID comms, into tactics to finish up, and this is pretty much where I'm finishing up, I think. Make the invisible visible, which the government did do very well, that the agencies did very well. And what I mean by that is make the gas, with this advertising technique where you make the gas visible as if it's like a green fog. That's a really good idea, because one of the problems with this, of course, is it's invisible. And people, oh, is it real? Is it real? You know, I can't see it. Well, it's 1/10,000th the size of a full stop. That's fine. So you've got to artificially make it visible. That's a good technique, it seems to me, and there's demonstrable evidence on that. Keep on demonstrating good behaviours. Do demonstrations in your advertising. Hands, face, space, fresh air has become very boring, and people aren't listening. This is a common problem in marketing, as we know. So you've got to keep refreshing this creatively. We've bashed young people quite a lot in the press. The government didn't do this too much. Fair play to them. It was a press thing to bash young people about their lives and their lives. And in fact, we owe them our thanks very much, I believe, in this country. And I was involved quite a lot with some work on how to communicate to young people through this pandemic. And that by and large, they've been brilliant. Longer term, we need a conversation about death rates, as I mentioned. In the future, I think it would be a great idea if we stopped eating bats. I don't know about you, but that looks a bit of a no-brainer to me, and I think we should call that out. And I'm fed up with the fact that we don't call this out. I just don't understand that. I think we should call this out. I think we should also cut down on eating meat, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror here. And I've got a car, by the way, so I'm looking at myself on this one as well. What has car use got to do with this pandemic? It's kind of got nothing and everything to do with it. It's a public health, it's a huge public health enemy. Cars are the new tobacco. Our car use, our addiction to cars in the Western world is and throughout the world, it is just killing the planet, it's killing us. If we do these things, we'll be much more resilient next time a virus hits us. So there you go. I said, Christine, that I'd try and motor through it, and hopefully I've kept my promise. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. That's me.
Alan, thank you. Thank you very much. You promised to be provoking and challenging, and you've certainly done that.
Oh, good.
Great to see the question and answer session. But without further ado, before we get to question and answers, we're going to go to our second speaker, Professor Gerard Hastings. Many of you will know Gerard from his work in Stirling University and from his many publications and his books, and including his new book, which is Our Hyperconsumption. Gerard, over to you. That's wonderful, Gerard. We can see your PowerPoints, but we're not hearing you. So you might be on mute.
Gerard, you're on mute, mate.
So it's the little icon in.
No,
yeah.
got it.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
You're off.
so I'm off. Success. Okay, Christine said I'm a storyteller, so let me start with a story. This is a very ancient story. It comes from the Sufi tradition, so it's at least hundreds of years old. And it talks of Mullah Nasruddin. And in this story, Mullah Nasruddin has gone into the donkey selling business. So every week he takes a donkey down to the local market and he sells it. And his donkeys are good and his prices are low. So he does very well. He always sells his donkey and his business becomes quite a success, somewhat to the chagrin of the other market sellers each week. And eventually one of these gets so grumpy about it, he takes the mullah aside and he says, listen, I'm a businessman like you. I know about the cut and thrust of competition, but you're killing me. How can I compete with you? I'm a wealthy man. I own many, many fields. I rent these out to poor peasants at an outrageous rent, and they pay that rent, a lot of it in grain, so I can feed my donkeys for nothing. I have a squad of servants who look after and care for the donkeys. I pay them a pittance, and yet still, when I come to the market, I can't compete with your prices. Tell me how you do it. I'll make it worth your while. And the mullah responds, I see the problem immediately, he said. You're stealing the land, the grain, and the labor. I'm stealing the donkeys. The point of the story is that when the system is so stacked against you, the only thing you can do is resort to criminality, then surely the system has to change. And I think it's a very appropriate juncture in our story to face up to that idea of the need to change. Alan started to touch on this now with COVID. The big lesson from COVID is not about masks, but it's about the need to change our lifestyles. And at this point, I could quote all sorts of and show all sorts of images of storms and fires and floods, and that the breakdown in our climate as it is happening. But I'll stick with just one study emerged earlier this year in Nature, which for me says everything about the need for us to change radically what we are doing. This is a study that has shown that if we took together all the stuff we human beings produce, all the cars, the plastic bags, the tin cans, the cars, the bicycles, the shopping trolleys, these now, as of 2020, outweigh all life on Earth, plant and animal put together. Plastics alone outweigh animals 2 to 1. Now that proportion was only 3% in 1900. If we continue as we are, and Glasgow seemed to suggest that we, broadly speaking, are going to, there'll be 3 times as much stuff by 2040. So change then is essential, but it's also inevitable. We cannot carry on like this. It is just not feasible. At the same time, as Alan again was hinting at, the need for change is a great opportunity, because surely we can improve on the mess that we're making at the moment, on a system built on the myth of infinite growth and the imperative of endless acquisition. And as that change goes forward, I would speak up for agency. I think we, the people of the planet, need to be the participants, not spectators and collateral. Fortunately, I would go on to argue, we have social marketing, which is the discipline of social change to help us, to guide us as we face these turbulent times. And I think it can make an enormous difference. Just as corporate marketing has turned us into devout consumers who destroy our bodies and our planet at the whim of large business, so social marketing can help us to become reflective and critical of that system, to become human beings again and do something about it. Now, I'm conscious that the audience we have today, the people on this call, some of whom are very familiar with social marketing, some for whom it is very, very new. So I've elected to just go back to basics and try and think for myself what for me are the key offers that social marketing brings to this challenge that we face. And for me, there are 2 basic ideas that are really, really important. And it's not just 2 individual ideas, 2 ideas that go hand in glove. I don't think you can choose between these. So I would say Alan's setting up a false dichotomy when he says agency versus structure. I think you have to have both. And surely in a democracy, structure is determined by agency. But these two ideas for me, I would call them grassroots empowerment. So all of us getting engaged and thinking about things and to bring about change. If we look at those two in a little more detail, grassroots empowerment, this is this idea of involving everyone as active agents, helping people to understand what the problems are and act to improve them. And I think with COVID, you can see that working extremely well. I'm, as Alan rightly said, I'm looking at the UK from the outside now, living in France. But from what I can see in England, at least, the people have been moving ahead of the government. So the structure has been left standing by people who've elected to wear masks, elected to behave in a more sensible ways in the face of COVID. That empowerment also guards against what I agree with Alan wholeheartedly are the hazards of behavioural economics and increasingly the digital sphere. We think of what's happening in China with the government's social behaviour programme, where they can control people's behaviour very, very effectively using digital technology, and behavioural economics, which nudges people to do the right thing without them even knowing they're doing it. And to my mind, at the very least, squanders teachable moment after teachable moment. But more importantly, I think starts to disempower people, starts to take away their agency. And I would go a step further and a bit deeper here. I think that agency is actually what makes us into human beings. It stops us being merely reactors to outside stimuli, whether that be consumers or anything else, and starts engaging our critical faculties to help us think through not just the logic of situations, but the morality of situations. It also, and I think this is true of COVID, which has become, I think, a very difficult, challenging level on an individual basis mentally. Helping people to cope with that is one of the big challenges of the pandemic. Equally with climate, you know, the despair that can come upon you when you consider the implications of climate can be devastating. And getting engaged, doing something, however small that might be, kindles hope. It helps us to think that we can make progress. And indeed, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you start to do that, things do change. You do stop eating meat, you do stop flying, and you feel better as a result, above and beyond any effect it might have on the system. Although I would argue that ultimately it will have an effect on the system, if only because systems are at the end of the day made up of individuals. Turning to collective action, undoubtedly this is vital. If you're living in poverty, if you're living with prejudice, how much agency have you got? How much agency have the people being shoved around in the east of Europe at the moment got? Yes, absolutely. You need to have laws in place, you need to have structures in place, you need to have systems in place that enable society to function properly. And that functioning properly, I would argue, it goes hand in glove with agency, people's ability to be the authors of their own fate and their communal fate. We need to deal with outside forces without a doubt, the commercial determinants of planetary ill health, you know, the oil companies, the tobacco companies, the crazy overconsumption that we engage in. These things have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with at a structural level as well as an individual level. And ultimately, this takes us into deep water, does it not? This is about power and democracy. You know, a functioning democracy is one in which the populace are actively engaged in the process of system development and system change. Otherwise, it becomes something else. Now, I think one of the big problems of our societies in Western Europe and Britain in particular is that our democracy has become quite enfeebled, that people aren't that heavily involved in it. They vote once every 5 years and then expect everything to happen. And it's not like that. Life is more difficult than that. So those are the two big ideas, I would say, that social marketing offers. I just want to now just move on and look at how those work in practice with a couple of examples. One directly from my own experience. This is about youth smoking, teen smoking, which is a glorious success story for the UK, I think, but maybe perhaps in a little contrast to COVID. And because we've gone to a situation now where teen smoking has virtually disappeared in the UK. It's about 4% young people smoking on a regular basis now. It's very, very low, which is a massive improvement on 20 years ago even. And how has that come about in 2 decades? Well, I would say it's come about, first of all, with grassroots empowerment. So we've informed young people about the dangers of smoking. And perhaps more importantly, we've informed them about the manipulative practices of the tobacco industry, which is a far more engaging argument for them than heart disease in 20 or 30 years' time, which seems very distant indeed. And when I talk about education, I don't mean education in a sort of handing down of information. I mean in the Yeatsian sense, education is about lighting fires rather than filling pails, and it's getting people engaged and cross and ready to do something. At the same time, we've had collective action. Government has moved to control, particularly tobacco marketing, with great effectiveness. It took a long time, a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat and tears, but nonetheless, they went through the whole marketing playbook of the tobacco industry and ripped them out one after another. And we've now got to a stage where teens aren't able to name a single tobacco brand, whereas 20 years ago, when we began doing surveys with them, they could name half a dozen. That's an immense progress. But again, it's not a matter of choosing between those. It's not grassroots empowerment or collective action. The two work hand in glove. So one of the key factors that encouraged government to act, and I saw this again and again over the last 20 years, was young people actually speaking about the problem. Young people's words were absolutely, could not be avoided by our politicians. They absolutely had to listen to these. And I've seen politicians change their minds as you have young people's voices speaking. So these three then work hand in glove with one another. And I think you can't say one's right and one's wrong. I think that they are all needed for progressive change. And as I'm arguing, I think we're in an era where, my God, we need progressive change. To bring us to that issue of the climate, this is another paper. This one was brought to my attention by George Monbiot, incidentally, who Alan name-checked as well. And here, in fact, he's arguing very, very strongly for agency. And he quotes this paper, which has looked at what they call social tipping processes, the extent to which, a bit like with climate itself, if you get a certain groundswell of opinion developing in society, then social attitudes can change. And the campaign that they particularly focus on and argue has been incredibly powerful is the one started by Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future. And it shows how the screenshots you see there are just something about Fridays for Future. And the map is the actions that this organization that's grown out of Greta's rebellion in Sweden just this week, just in the next 3 or 4 days. All these things happening all over the world. And in the paper, they talk specifically about its impact on politics in Europe and how it fed a massive increase in voting for Green parties in Germany, Austria, and a few other countries. The extent that it came, in their words, to close to taking Europe to a critical state, which would have a mammoth impact on the climate talks. Now, COVID got in the way, and it didn't quite happen as it intended, but it proved the point. It can do it. And Monbiot is really just, the quote from Monbiot is just confirming the same thing. So in conclusion, we live in momentous and turbulent times. Change is necessary, it's indeed inevitable, and it is to be welcomed. It gives us all a chance to fulfill our human potential in getting engaged in the process of producing a more agreeable, a more healthy, and a more sustainable common weal. We have to get engaged, and social marketing's combination of grassroots agency and collective action can give us a guide to going forward. Then we can concentrate on being human beings rather than mere consumers, and we can stop stealing the donkeys. Thanks very much for listening. Look forward to the discussion.
Jared, thank you. So We promised people who joined us this morning and those who are listening on the recording some very challenging discussions and presentations, and both yourself and Alan have certainly delivered on that in spades. So I'm going to open up the floor now to questions. So we have two mechanisms for you for questions or comments that you might like to make. We have our question and answer box, and we also have our raised hand facility as well. So to kickstart, we have a comment in here from Dimitri that's thanking Alan for a very thought-provoking as usual. And no questions, Dimitri is saying, but wondering about your description of COVID combating efforts. And he's saying that not opinionated, but very accurate storytelling. And he wants to hear a little bit more on structures beating individuals and systems being a vital role in that. So perhaps that's something both of you could actually comment to, that, you know, what is a healthy position or a healthy line between structure and agency, which also brings up the question of the boundary. What's the demarcation between healthy collectivism and healthy individualism? So we might start with and then go over to Gerard.
No, I really love Gerard's saying. I think Gerard nicely picked up on me being oversimplistic, I think, in what I was talking about. So these things always boil down to, or often boil down to, language in some ways, I think. But I mean, coming back to social marketing as a possible solution to some of this, I've long had in my mind a model that social marketing is at its most powerful when it generates a conversation and possibly a protest. So if you're happy and if everybody's happy, then you don't need to protest, fine. But if you do, then social marketing, I think it can be a wonderful campaigning. We have tools and techniques, comms, obviously, persuasion techniques. We have those things at our disposal as ways of as ways of triggering the kind of things that Gerard was talking about. I loved what Gerard was talking about. I think that really that's very, it's kicking around my head at the moment. So yeah.
I'm going to bring you back, Alan. I'm going to bring you back and that balance. You know, what is the line between structure and agency? So is COVID an example where some countries have managed the structure but not the agency, or they've managed agency but not structure?
I can't speak for anywhere else, I don't think. I haven't done an international sort of scan of this other than keeping a pretty sharp eye on some of the numbers and everything. So maybe Gerard could comment internationally on it more. But I think in the UK, I think that's a good point, Gerard. I think the UK population did get ahead of the government. And there was to your point, Christine, about where's the balance to be struck? The UK population, the populace, got ahead because we by and large are being quite cautious as people in the UK. We're being pretty cautious now in how we do hands, face, fresh air and testing and all that. Obviously there are many exceptions, but there's a cautiousness. I've tested this. I do a lot of public opinion work for the funders, and so I speak with a bit of background on that at least. And so that there is that people take matters into their own hands when they can smell something bad going on. That's and I think that's some of the things that
I agree. I think the relationship between the individual and the system is dynamic. And it will change dramatically, and it will exist even in the most desperate of circumstances. So, Primo Levi even talks about the inhabitants of the camps having agency, even in that most extreme of extreme circumstances. And his argument is that if your final agency that you must never let go of is the right and the ability to remove to refuse your consent. I'm not going to go along with this. Even if it all ends up happening anyway, at least you retain that. You asked about France, and because of course COVID has been handled differently here. In particular, we have something called a pass sanitaire. So if I want to go out anywhere in a hospitality sense, a coffee, a meal, a cinema, I have to take with me a QR code proving I've been double vaxxed. And indeed, as of the end of the year, that'll have to be triple vaxxed. And that is, in a sense, it is the ultimate system, because you literally cannot have a meal out without the government say so effectively. And that's caused a lot of discussion about freedom and so on. I think what happens though in these circumstances, some people will still, there's still a lot of people who have not vaccinated and are determined to fight it, the anti-vaxxers you were talking about, who I don't dismiss. I think they have a legitimate concern, and I could clearly string them up sometimes, but I get where they're coming from. But what I like about the pass sanitaire is it gives you the sense that the guy in charge knows what he's doing, he's made up his mind and he's sticking to it, and that's there's a comfort in that, and a system that's I can understand that is rational. I think it rewards good behaviour. I feel my friends I've got who have not vaxxed, I think they are guilty of shoddy thinking, sloppy thinking. I think they are being selfish, and at some place on the line there should be, as you say, that your freedom to swing your fist stops at the end of my nose sort of argument. And so I think it is really interesting, and I guess the crucial thing for me is that it kicks off a debate about these liberties and where the line draws between individual and the collective. And you start to think about these things, and that for me ultimately is, maybe I've just spent too long in academia, but that's the perfect society to me, where everybody thinks critically about what's going on.
100%. There's, I think that coming back to the politics of it, I've been political, so I might as well carry on. The left get this wrong sometimes, Christine, in my view. And what I mean by that is, if this guy, I've just picked this out because it just reminded me, Chris Mullin was a Labour MP, and he wrote some brilliant diaries. And Chris was puzzled. He wrote really eloquently about how puzzled he was after years and years of investment and Labour government, having one or two constituents come in to see him, and they were really fed up and grumpy about, and he was like, but we've given them everything, and so why? And I think the answer lies with what Gerard's been talking about. The Labour government gave disadvantaged people everything except agency. That's a view that I think it was too centralised. It was too command and control. The Gordon Brown, wonderful man. I'm such a fan, right? Don't get me wrong from a political point of view, but I think the left get this wrong quite a lot. They don't do agency very well. They do command and control, and we'll tell you, we'll help you. Actually, people don't want to be helped from the top. They want to be empowered.
Well,
back to you, Prof.
I was just going to say there's a very big redolent example of that in Glasgow, because I know you've picked, having lived near Glasgow and worked in Glasgow for a long time, I'm very familiar with this, but Glasgow's got this issue that its public health is crap, even when compared to other post-industrial cities like Liverpool or Manchester. There's an additional factor that takes Glasgow down a peg. its life expectancy, its public health measures are down. And the received wisdom on that now, after years and years and decades of study, is that it confirms exactly what you're saying. Glasgow, was absolutely a city of the Industrial Revolution. It suddenly went from a small town into a massive city, and the capitalism that broke out there was completely rapacious. So the houses were poorer, the conditions of living were worse, and so on. And that went on until the turn of the last century, when the strong left wing moved back against it, to the extent that British Army tanks were on the streets of Glasgow in 1918 because they thought we were going to follow down Moscow's route, and Glasgow returning communist MPs up until the 1950s. And the thinking is that in both cases, one with benign intent and the other with greed in mind, was a lack of agency. So the left-wing council took over and it started the schemes and just decanted people from the slums in the town to the schemes in the suburbs without any consultation whatsoever. Now, you know, the slums were horrible, but they had community, and those communities were trashed. And that was so there's a lack of agency that explained the additional public health problems of Glasgow.
There's something beautiful in your discussions from both of you about agency, because clearly you're talking about social marketing and its renowned agency for the individual. But get a sense going forward, particularly when you start to bring in the collective view, that agency has to move to small groups. It has to move to families and to communities and to workplaces. That individual agency is important going forward, but that small group community agency to give you the collective agency is important. Before I go any further with that though, we do have a raised hand. So I would like, Anya, if you're still there with us and you have your question, if it hasn't already been answered, can I invite you on? You're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Thanks, Christine. No, and actually apologies. I think I was trying to look at the Q&A and I accidentally pressed the raise hand. But thanks to the two speakers. I've worked with Christine before on the flu vaccine, and Anya McNamara is my name, I'm a consultant in public health medicine here in the West in Galway, and it's been fascinating listening to both the speakers, because I suppose I'm completely immersed in COVID at the moment, managing outbreaks left, right and centre. So it's really interesting, the vaccine, the hesitancy, we'd seen it before. So the pass sanitaire and our own in Ireland, we do have you need a COVID pass as well here, Jared, that go into restaurants and stuff like that. We've actually had a very good vaccine uptake, but historically our rates would be kind of good, I suppose, in terms of primary childhood vaccination. So there's just a lot there. And I just, when you're talking there about the agency, I think of even, in a way, we've seen it in some of the responses that we've had, even in, I suppose I would call it the HSE and the healthcare, the people coming together and working all hours, all days to respond. And, you know, I've been able to ring people at any time of the day and they've said to me, yeah, no problem. You know, the way they've just got on, we've cracked on and we've managed it in a time of crisis. And I think we've done it without maybe public health as well. We've had individuals, a bit like the UK, we haven't had the structure, we haven't had the funding behind us prior to this. And so we had individuals, but we had no systems behind us to help us get through this. So, you know, it's just been, it's been an interesting phenomenon. Nice listening to you. And sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, so I'll stop now. But maybe when my head is a little bit clearer and out of COVID, I can come back to this again. But thanks, it's been great.
I think you've picked up on something really, really important, which is, maybe I'm over-influenced by I saw a film last night, Nomadland. And, you know, what came across in that and what we've just been talking about is, well, to use Tennessee Williams, I think his phrase, the kindness of strangers. You know, so you know, we're talking about individuals and we're talking about systems, governments, and there's a hell of a lot in between, as Christine was implying. And you know, and that's one example. You know, somebody who you've never even met, doesn't know who you are, helps you out of a mess, a difficult situation, and that's a powerful concept. And it takes me back to this idea that, on the one hand, we've got to empower people to be able to think like that and to do things like that. But on the other hand, we've always got to have a watchful eye on the extent to which we allow everybody into that space. So, you know, we have two old, middle-aged, middle-class white men talking. You know, what happened to the black women? You know, that you've got to be very conscious of those, and it's very easy to glory in your own agency without remembering that a lot of people are struggling to exhibit agency. At Stirling, our chancellor used to be Jim Naughtie, the journalist, and he used to give a talk at at graduation each year, and one has lived with me ever since he gave it. And it was all these fresh-faced students out about to go out into the world in their gowns and very, very successful and starting on good careers and so on. And he just said to them, remember, you don't always notice when you're walking through open doors. There's a lot of people who are faced with closed doors where you wander through even without realizing there's a door there. And it's, I think we've got to build a society in which that is absolutely the case, and people like Alan and I take a back seat.
Thank you, and thank you, Anya, for that. There's loads more, Anya, I'd love to catch up with you on too that you raised. Like, I'd be very interested to hear about how the people in the system, like yourself and the nurses and the doctors, how they're making those changes happen and finding agency within the system to change it internally. But we're going to have to leave that for another day because I've got loads of other questions coming in here. Hamilton is on and raises a very important point, and he's saying there's more comment, but I would love to hear back from you, that there's a growing movement in the UK towards new models for public management based on learning that'll catalyze social marketing's contribution. So any comments from either of you on emerging public management that are taking cognizance of, that are bringing in that kind of agency that both of you have been talking about?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, and thank you for bringing it up. I'm conscious of experience I've had here in France, where I've got involved with a cooperative bookshop, and it's become, I was completely unaware of this, but in getting involved in this, I've realized that this French government puts immense resources at your disposal if you want to start up your own system. It's not a commercial operation, it's a non-profit, but it's run as as any bookshop would be. It has to wash its face and so on, but there's all sorts of training and grant support and advice available to help this business run in a collective way. And that basically is funded by crowdfunding. Local people have bought shares in this organization. And I think it's a really good reminder that there are alternative models of, it's not just, the system versus the individual. There's the system, the individual, and lots of things in between. You were talking about family earlier on, Christine, but all these other structures. And yes, absolutely, we should be trying to develop and encourage and help these. And again, I think social marketing has a great role to play in that.
And Alan, and any last words from you? And are you seeing other forms of public management that intrigue you or that you think may be valuable going forward?
Just thinking about the fact that I'm motoring towards retirement, and so I'm going to kind of I'm already involved in a few things. I'm trustee of a couple of charities and things, if that's what we're hinting at here. But those are tried and tested. I mean, I intend to get involved locally with stuff, and so I want to be an active citizen, knowing selfishly that it make me happy. There's a selfish side to this. I'd be a happier man rather than just being a consumer. I'm happy to do a bit of Gerald will be appalled to hear I intend to be a bit of a consumer. We're all consumers, Alan. We can't avoid that. Spend a bit of money before I'm not giving it all to the kids. Good God. But just being a consumer is an empty vessel, isn't it? It's an empty vessel. I don't mind going skiing or whatever it is, but it's pretty bloody pointless. And you need a point to life. So I don't know if that's a roundabout way of answering the question. But
no, it's a perfect answer, and it's also a perfect place to bring us as we wrap up our series of social marketing celebrations. So we have reached the last minute of our last webinar. So I would like to thank both of you for joining, and also say to everybody who's joined us, Alan and Jared have agreed to come over to the west coast of Ireland, the Wild Atlantic Way, sometime in October. So watch for that when we have a live session with our two gentlemen, and we can continue on the stories and the storytelling and the conversations. What remains now for me to do is to thank you for joining us over this year, from last January through the spring and into the autumn. Thank you for your valuable time and for your valuable questions. And to say we have a small little Christmas gift for you. So watch out for the 1st of December and a posting that will wrap up the year and our celebrations. Thanks, everybody. Signing off.
Cheers, Christine.
Cheers, all the best, Christine. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.